and gentlemen. I'm going to give it another 10 seconds before I close this window. That's it. We're now on YouTube. It is fantastic. Welcome to all those millions of people out there that are watching this on YouTube. And it is available on Zoom right over here with us, as well as in person for all the wonderful human beings that decided to join us here today. For anyone who's offended that I called you a human being, I didn't mean you. But it's wonderful to be together with everybody as we do our next session in our course, which is called Captivating Cases in Rabbinic Response. And I'm going to the slideshow and I'm going to bring it up on the screen for the benefit of the people at home, as well as for the people that are watching it on YouTube, wherever they may be. So, ladies and gentlemen, there we go. So, Captivating Cases in Rabbinic Response. Today is lesson 3 in our course. And the topic for today is precedent in practice. How past rulings are applied to new realities. Does anyone have any questions or comments? See, I knew it. Okay, yes.
Nothing changes, I would think.
Yes, Gila, what's the question?
Well, right at the end of chapter 2, I don't remember us reading it, Titanic question that a woman was crying out why she was forbidden to say Kaddish over relatives who were lost on the Titanic. And my question is, since Jewish history has so many cases of people who are missing in action or just missing criminal reasons or for unknown reasons or eaten by a bear or something, is there some prayer that's in between the Kaddish, at least saying some prayer, like for this poor guy that no one could say Kaddish over him?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. Gila's asking a very, very interesting question. The question is, how does Jewish law deal with the issue when somebody passes away, but their death can't be confirmed for whatever reason? It's a very, very big conversation, and there are many ramifications of this question. Gila asked specifically with regards to the issue of saying Kaddish. The truth is, the issue is much bigger than the issue of Kaddish, because it's got to do with the issue very often of whether the woman can get remarried and to be considered the husband to be dead, or to be considered her to be an aguna. It is a major, major topic that is beyond the scope of our conversation this morning. Thank you for raising the question, Gila. It's a question that needs a tremendous amount of analysis. So
Well,
thank you
there's
for.
the Chalitza.
I understand. So we can't, and I appreciate Gila read that in the extra text from last week's class. We'll have to talk about that after class today. So thank you for the question, but we'll deal with it after class. So I'm happy to discuss that at greater length. Anyone who wants to have a conversation about that, I invite you to join me and Gila after class to continue that conversation.
Is it covered in the book Kaddish? I'm serious.
I don't know. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, everybody. We are going to try this again. We're starting for the second time, lesson 3. Precedent in practice. How past rulings are applied to new realities. How past rulings are applied to new realities. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to refresh your memory and remind you that in lesson 1 of this course, we focused on the kinds of people that asked the questions. In lesson 2 of this course, we spoke about the importance that the by answering the question needs to place on getting the facts and actually understanding the information. Very often people give halakhic rulings without even knowing, or it's possible to give a halakhic ruling without knowing what you're talking about. All right? Without knowing the facts of the story. Without knowing the facts of the story. Now, the important thing over here is to actually ascertain the facts. So, in good responsa, the kind of responsa that lasts for hundreds of years, in the kind of responsa that we're still reading today, people found out that the facts are ascertained properly. These are very important principles. Actually doing your homework to understand that you're dealing with a real situation as it presents itself. That's a very important lesson in life. That's a very important lesson in life. In America, the custom is to have an opinion about something without knowing the facts. Okay? Somebody once pulled me up about a certain conflict somewhere, and he said, "I know who's right and I know who's wrong, and don't confuse me with the facts."
Yeah.
Okay, and then it became popular in America to have alternate facts, right? We start making up our facts. That's not going to work. That's not going to work for anybody in the long run. In the long run, we've got to know what the facts are. We have to really do our homework. We have to do it properly. And in rabbinic responsa, that's one of the most important things. That was last week's class. Okay. Today's class, ladies and gentlemen, is going to focus more on the legal analysis. Legal analysis. How precedent is applied in practice. So, very difficult questions that arose in Jewish history and how those questions were dealt with by looking at earlier legal precedent. That's the subject of today's class. What we will see is by studying this fascinating body of rabbinic literature called Responsa, where some of the greatest minds and the greatest scholars and judges in previous generations had to ask some of the most difficult questions. So we learned a tremendous amount of history by reading through this responsa, and more historians are turning to halakhic responsa as a very important primary source of understanding the history of the time. So we're going to give some classic examples of that in today's class. Very, very interesting topics today specifically. Actually, I say that every week. You know why I say it every week? Because it's true. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, precedent in practice, how past rulings are applied to new reality. So we open our course today with a genius of a rabbi, a man by the name of Moses, also known as Moshe. Anyone know what Moshe's last name was? Rabbeinu. There's two opinions. Some say it was Moshe Rabbeinu. The other one said it was Moshe Lamor. His last name was Lamor. As it says in the Torah, Davar Hashem el Moshe Lamor. And God spoke to Moses saying, that's an old joke that I learned in, I think, probably first grade, if not second grade. Forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, for going to such a juvenile place in my past. Okay. Moses himself used this type of legal rationale, says the Midrash. In other words, applying principles to determine law. Last week's parsha we read about the golden calf. And when Moses came down and he saw the golden calf, he broke the tablets. Remember that?
Yeah.
Page 103 in our books, the Talmud asks, what reasoning did Moses apply to break the tablets? What was his legal rationale? Right? What legal basis did he rely upon? So he used a halakhic process. He used a process of analysis and logic. He said, I was explicitly told that an idol worshipper may not eat from the paschal lamb, which is only one of the 613 mitzvot. If so, now that Israel has worshipped the golden calf, they are certainly unworthy of receiving all 613 mitzvot. If an idol worshipper can't get one, so then these people can't get any, and he broke the tablets. Okay, it's an example of legal rationale. Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, there are other examples as well. I'm not going to say it's not the best one. It's great. There are others as well. But that's a lot. Anyway, we bring it in over there. But we use this as an opening to show the idea of legal things. What I'm going to do now, ladies and gentlemen, is I'm going to show the lesson video for today's class. What I'm going to do even more than that, I'm going to do something very quickly that's going to make our experience here today.
Can I comment on that? Why you brought the?
I'd rather you don't, but if you really want to, then we can. Because it's not working.
Just
Can I hear?
As long as it doesn't become a discussion. Okay, wait a second. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Right, that's my. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna do it over here. Share. we're coming back to the, wait, okay, I've got to go back to the PowerPoint, which is over here. Play from current slides, go over here, use slideshow. Back to meeting, I've got to get the people at home to see it. Share. You are screen sharing and they see it at home. Am I right that you see this at home? Can somebody at home say, can you see this, Lauren? Can you see the screen? You can. Brilliant. Okay. Brilliant. Play. So much technology. Okay, there we go.
In the spring of 1475, the city of Trent in northern Italy became the site of a tragedy. The body of 2-year-old Simon was found in a canal beneath the home of a Jewish family. Within days, all 18 Jewish men of the city were arrested. Under torture, they confessed to murdering the boy to use his blood in a Jewish ritual, an accusation with no basis in Jewish law or practice. All 18 were sentenced to death. The Jewish community of Trent was effectively erased. But the story didn't end there. A year later, in 1476, Bishop Heinrich of Regensburg passed through Trent on his way home from Rome. He learned that one of the tortured men had named Jews in Regensburg, accusing them of committing a similar crime nearly a decade earlier. Heinrich brought the confessions back to Regensburg. In the spring of 1476, the city arrested 17 of its most prominent Jews. Their families were placed under house arrest. Jewish assets across the city were frozen, and the torture began again. Some of the accused resisted, others broke under pressure. The resulting confessions were contradictory and confused. Dates didn't line up. Locations varied widely. Yet the authorities pressed on. They needed physical proof. So on April 22nd, 1476, the cellar of one of the accused was excavated. After 3 days, bones were discovered, said to be the remains of 4 children. But doubts quickly surfaced. Ronnie Pochashar, in The Myth of Ritual Murder, writes, according to a legal brief in defense of the 17 Jews and presented at the imperial court, the excavation was not supervised by disinterested parties. Soldiers and authorities were not called in until the 3rd day, and one soldier actually expressed his distrust of the workers entrusted with the digging. Some thought the bones had been planted to frame the Jews. Men were seen removing bones from the Christian cemetery. At the imperial court in Vienna, Emperor Frederick III ordered the Jews' release. Regensburg officials resisted, asserting their city's autonomy for criminal cases. A tense standoff dragged on until May 1478, when a compromise was reached. The prisoners would be freed, but only after paying an exorbitant sum, 10,000 florins to the emperor, 5,000 to the city for the trial and prison costs, 8,000 more to cover a fine the emperor had levied against the city for their disobedience in this case. In total, 23,000 florins, an impossible sum. Though Jews across the region gave generously, it wasn't enough. The prisoners remained locked away. German rabbis convened in Nuremberg. Should they impose a tax on every Jewish community in the empire to free the Jews of Regensburg? How far could they go to buy justice?
So, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, it's a fascinating story in Jewish history with many, many, many layers to this topic. So obviously, these confessions were forced confessions. They were not real confessions. The Jews were not doing this, but it is incredibly difficult, obviously, not to break under that kind of torture. They wanted their confessions. They got their confessions. But even contemporary people realized, including the emperor, that the whole thing was a farce. So now comes the question, money has to get paid to free these Jews. The local community cannot raise the money. The question is, can they legally require all the communities in the empire to chip in for the cost? Can they legally require it? In other words, can they say this is a legal tax on all the communities? You all have an obligation to pay. If you don't pay, enforcement will be through excommunication, which is a tool that communities had, called chayrim. That's how enforcement will be held. And if you don't pay, you'll be excommunicated from the Jewish community. Is there a legal right to assess? And the question over here comes down to, in other words, to go out and raise the money through voluntary tzedakah is an option. They don't want to use that option. They want to say that there's a financial obligation of all the communities to pay for this. In other words, they want to go to civil court and tell Jews in other communities, in other areas of the empire, that you have a financial obligation to chip in for this. You have a civil financial obligation. When we ask you for money over here, you owe us the money. Is that true or not? That's the question that comes to the rabbi. The rabbi in today's class is one of the most important rabbi in Central Europe at that time and for all time. A rabbi by the name of the Maharik will be the one who gets the question. We're going to come back to him. We're going to turn a few pages back, but please turn to page 112, where in the margin of page 112, you will see Rabbi Yosef Cologne, the Maharik. Rabbi Cologne was born in France. Eventually, he settled in northern Italy, where he held several important rabbinical positions. His responsa were internationally famous and widely circulated. Rabbi Avadia of Bertanura, the noted commentator on the Mishnah, was his student. Bertanura, as you have usually the other one, Bertanura or something. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, the point is, we're dealing with one of the most important rabbis of his period, and to this day, the writings of the Maharik are still considered some of the most authoritative and important writings on every topic, including this one. So he gets the question now, ladies and gentlemen, he wants to know, can we obligate other people to pay? Can we obligate other communities in the empire to pay to help ransom these Jews from Regensburg? Is it Regensburg or Regensburg? Regensburg. Okay. Ladies, I'm sure in Regensburg, they don't say it like that. They have an accent. Okay.
They think we have an accent.
Well, l'chaim, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. So, here's the question. I have a question for you. How do we answer this question? How does he answer the question? What should he do to answer the question?
Look for precedents.
Very good. Look for precedents. Look for precedents. Okay. He is going to find precedent. He's going to find the precedent in a fascinating place. He's going to find the precedent in a fascinating place. He's going to look for it in the laws of, turn to page 107, look at the picture. You see a town with a stream running through it, a river runs through it. You see that?
Yeah.
But do you see in the middle of the picture, the water got blocked up by some sediment? So we're going to want to know who has to pay to remove the sediment to get the river flowing properly again. This is an issue that is dealt with in the Talmud. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, he wants to know how far downstream can we obligate people to pay for issues. It's a very interesting concept. We're not going to be dealing with a river, a literal river over here, but we're dealing with issues of how far downstream from the incident does the issue apply. You hear what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Figuratively. So, looking at the screen again for a second, here are the facts. 17 Jewish men were falsely charged with murder in Regensburg in 1476. freeing them came at an exorbitant cost. The rabbis were inclined to impose a tax on other Jewish communities of the Holy Roman Empire. You know what they say about the Holy Roman Empire? Tell us, Jerry.
It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire.
Thank you. Okay, that's the famous thing about the Holy Roman Empire, which is all true, by the way.
But
Okay.
can I just ask one little
Except it
thing?
might have been a little bit of an empire. Yes. Rachel.
Sorry, how was it, it was just accepted that they would have to pay to be released to begin with? They, why, I mean, how is that? Nobody protested that?
They did, but the mullahs killed 30,000 of them. Okay, now protesting is not an option. There's no option to protest over here. You
And there
don't
was
have to
no
pay. You
laws.
could let them stay there. You could let them stay there. Now the question is, obviously, the community has to do them. One of the important things is a very, very famous discussion that often comes up with the Maharam of Rothenburg, in a famous discussion that the Talmud says not to ransom captives for more than they are worth, whatever that means, not to ransom captives for more than worth, because it encourages more captive taking. In this case, nobody even thought that was relevant, because this is not an issue that anyone thought is going to encourage captive taking. Captive taking isn't really there's no financial, it's got nothing to do with it. This isn't, the issue over here is how do you get these people free and how do you deal with the blood libels? That's really the most important. How do you
And that was in more
and,
than one community.
and in this community, and we're going to see there was becoming a widespread issue in Europe. We already saw it started in another community, right? It came to this community.
That's
So
important.
that's going to be very, very important, because that's the issue is this danger flowing downstream? That's really the question we have to see that's going on here. That's how he dealt with it. So Elaine is already hitting the nail on the head. They were unsure of the legitimacy of the tax. So they reached out for guidance. They wanted to impose the tax, but you need the leading rabbis in the area to agree that it's the right thing to do. And a tax that's a theft is an illegitimate tax. You can only tax if there's a legal reason to allow it. So this question comes to the Maharik. Can all the Jews in the Holy Roman Empire be taxed to fund the release of the Jews in Regensburg? So the precedent he looks to is a case in the Talmud about river blockage. Cases in the Talmud about river blockage. So before we look to what the Talmud has to say, let me ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what you think. Case number one, you can see it on the screen or you can see it in your books. Case number one, a river, and by the way, if anyone doesn't have a book yet, please let me know, send me an email and I'll arrange you a book. A river flows through multiple communities. Over time, sedimentation causes reduced downstream flow. Over time, sedimentation causes reduced downstream flow. Who is responsible for the sediment removal? Okay, so you see what's going on. Case one, you've got the houses over here. You need the water. It's getting blocked up at the top over here. A has water. B, you could see they're getting less water and it's pretty much blocked, but they can walk around to there. And C, by now, there's almost no water left because of the sedimentation over there. Who has to pay to unblock this? Is it all communities along the river have a shared obligation to pay for this? What do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Do you think A, all communities have to pay along the river? B, do you think only those downstream of the blockage, meaning B and C? Or C, do you think only those upstream of the blockage, A, should have to pay? So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a vote. Let's look at the people on the screen for a second as well. If you think all the communities should have to pay, raise your hands. Okay, we've got a bunch of people that say all. If you think only those downstream should have to pay, raise your hands. We've got a few votes for downstream, and if you think only those upstream should have to pay, raise their hands. Nobody thinks that. Okay.
I have a question.
No questions.
question.
Thank you very much.
Question.
No questions. Thank you very much. Case number two.
It's the wrong question to apply.
Case number two. Case number two. We'll get questions later. All questions can come later. Case number two. A drainage canal. So this is different. This is to get the water. This is a water source. Now we're talking about a drainage canal that's getting the water out of town, right? You want the rainwater to go away, otherwise you get, what happens if your drainage canal blocks up? You get
Floods.
flood. So we need to deal with flooding. A drainage canal that removes water from the roads serves multiple communities on a hillside. The canal becomes clogged, preventing water from draining. Who is responsible for clearing the blockage? If you think all communities that rely on the drainage canal should have to chip in, all the communities have to chip in for the drainage, raise your hand. Okay, a bunch of people here say all of them. If you think only those downhill below the blockage have to pay for the drainage, raise a hand. No one thinks that. If you think only those uphill above the blockage, A and B, then raise your hand. We got one vote for that. I have a question for Jerry Francisstock. I'm going to ask you, because Jerry is a Talmudic
No
scholar.
question. No questions.
Jerry, I have a question for you. Why in the first case did you say only those downstream, while in the second case you said all the communities?
Well, in this case, all the communities really benefit from the drainage. In the
Huh?
prior, all the communities benefit to some degree from the canal, the drainage. In the first case, only certain communities benefit.
They all benefit from the river. In the first case, if the river's flowing, they all benefit.
Yeah, but the guy in A, it benefits regardless.
Whether or not it's not, but in case C, he doesn't have a drainage problem. In case 2, guy number in C doesn't have a drainage problem.
I defer to Josh.
Which is what?
I,
Okay, doesn't matter. No, not
One
yet.
word.
Ladies and gentlemen, I love you guys, but not yet.
He's
Talmudic water status, we're
forget
gonna
about
deal
the
with it.
law, let me speak.
No,
Yeah.
no, page 109. Thank you very much. Talmud Bava Metzia 108a. This is how the Talmud deals with the matter. Now, very important detail, ladies and gentlemen. The Talmud is not discussing whether the government has the right to tax everybody. That's a separate issue, obviously a government. The Talmud wants to know over here if there is a financial obligation according to civil law between neighbors outside of a tax. In other words, does your neighbor actually owe you money if you clear this thing or not? Did you, and the principles that, so let's see. Rabbi Yehuda taught, and this is the passage from the Talmud, it's a little bit cryptic. Rabbi Yehuda taught, it's 3 lines in the Talmud, 4 lines in the Talmud. Look, in the Talmud itself, it's probably less than 4 lines. But it's a few words, and it's a very, very important thing. Do you understand? This little passage is going to determine what's going to happen to the Jews of Regensburg, those 17 prisoners. It's all going to be dependent on these words here. It's wild if you think about that. A few words in the Talmud are still reverberating until today. Rabbi Yehuda taught concerning the digging of a river, the lower ones must assist the upper ones, but the upper ones need not assist the lower ones. The reverse is true regarding draining rainwater. That is a very cryptic statement. The Talmud is written in a very concise style, very cryptic. It's hard to follow what the Talmud is saying. So for this, let's turn to the most important of the commentaries on the Talmud, Rashi. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the great sage of France, who explains, not just France, the great sage of New Canaan, the great sage of the whole world, Rashi, right? Lives with us every single day. Rashi says like this. This is what the Talmud is addressing. Page 110. When those upstream repair the obstruction in the river that's adjacent to their community, the downstream communities are obligated to assist them, since a blockage upstream prevents water from flowing down towards them. Thus, fixing the upper section benefits those downstream. Key words, highlight it, circle it, underline it, memorize it. The key word is benefits. but the upper ones need not assist the lower ones when repairs are made downstream, because these do not benefit those upstream. In fact, the repairs below harm those upstream. The more water that rushes forward, the less water is available upstream, which risks their fields drying out. It actually suits the people upstream very well to have more water. The reverse is true regarding draining rainwater. This applies to a city where excessive rainwater causes mud pileup and road damage. So a drainage channel is built to divert water outside the city. I'm going to close that door in a sec. Can you close that door for me, Claude, so that we don't hear that machine? This applies to a city where excessive rainwater causes mud buildup and road damage. So a drainage channel is built to divert water outside the city. If a blockage occurs in the section belonging to the lower residence, requiring it to be dug out, those upstream must assist in clearing it. Because as long as the lower section remains clogged, water will accumulate and flood the upper areas. However, the lower ones have no obligation to assist the upper ones in clearing drain blockages in the higher area, because the residents below favor that the upper water does not drain to the lower area. Okay? Everybody understand the case? So basically, the Talmud and the way Rashi understands it says, if you're going to benefit, you have to chip in. If you're not going to benefit, you do not have to chip in the case of a flowing river or a drainage. So in case A, B, and in case 1, who benefits from this? Does A benefit from opening up the river? In case 1 on the screen. Why is this not moving?
No, they're not affected.
No. A is quite happy for the river not to be opened up, and therefore A does not have to pay to open it up by Talmudic law. B benefits, he has to pay. C benefits, he has to pay. In case 2, does A benefit by unclogging the drain? Yes, he has to pay. Does B benefit? Yes, he has to pay. Does C benefit? No. So therefore C does not have to pay. This is the precedent that the Maharik is going to draw upon for dealing with the issue of the captives of Regensburg. So how does the Maharik deal with it? How do you think, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to ask, how do you think this applies to our story? Anyone want? We need one volunteer who's going to put up their hand and suggest how they think this can apply to the Jews of Regensburg. Elaine.
Well, what happens to the Jews there affects all Jews because it was spreading already.
So that's exactly what the Maharik is going to say. Maharik is going to say this issue is flowing downstream. And the people downstream need this issue to go away. And since the entire Jewish world, or at least the Jewish community of the Holy Roman Empire and all these lands is going to benefit by this issue being put to rest, they all have an obligation to pay to help put this issue to rest. So let's read it in his own words, ladies and gentlemen, page 112, text 5a. Yeah, this is the answers to the things on the screen. Okay. So, page 112, the Maharik, Rabbi Yosef Cologne. It is well known and widely recognized that the imprisonment of our brethren from the holy community of Regensburg, may their rock protect and strengthen them, is an event that poses potential harm and danger not only to Regensburg and its surrounding areas, but in many other communities as well. This is not the rabbis who have gathered at Nuremberg to save those wrongly sentenced to death, emphasize this point in their letter to me. So that's a very important thing.
Not
Yes.
to be disrespectful of the precedent, but did they really need the Talmud to tell
I
them
was
that?
thinking the same
Like,
thing. It's
wouldn't-
obvious.
Wouldn't these wise rabbis understand that it affects other communities as well?
And if it affects other communities, do they have a financial obligation to pay?
And I'm saying, what, wouldn't they have come to the same conclusion without referring
It's
to
a
the
great
Talmud?
question. It's a great question. If it affects other communities, do they have a financial obligation to chip in?
And I'm thinking the rabbis are wise enough to know this.
Well,
I think
I'm asking you a question. If it affects other communities, do they have a financial obligation to chip in?
Personally, I would say yes.
Okay, so that's great. What you said is right.
But it's,
And what's best about what you said, what I love the most about what you said is personally, I think.
Mhm.
By saying personally, I think means you might think this, but when somebody shows up at somebody's doorstep in
get the money.
in Munich or wherever where somewhere else asking for a check, he's going to say, personally, I think not.
yeah.
So
No,
therefore,
I
by going
understand
to
that.
precedent and by going to law, he's saying this isn't a question based on, it's not us. Talmudic law dictates that there's an obligation. And that's why appealing to earlier precedent, he's establishing law based on ancient law, and therefore saying this is a legal obligation that you have that goes back. It's not us deciding. We're not the rabbis now. Talmud says you have a legal obligation to pay.
Got it.
It's like in America, if the Congress can pass a law, but if it's in the Constitution, that has a lot more weight. So applying things that go back to much earlier precedents, and this is the way it's always been dealt with, has a much more forcible legal obligation.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. So if you go to page 114, he says like this: in my humble opinion, any Jewish community that is reasonably at risk and would almost certainly face the same fate, God forbid, if this matter is not properly addressed, these communities must take part in the financial burden. Saving the holy community of Regensburg ultimately means saving themselves as well, while the opposite outcomes in Regensburg would bring dire consequences to them. Heaven forbid. Even though at this moment the libel is directed only at Regensburg and not at other locations, still, because the calamity would inevitably spread to them as well. He has to say inevitable. It's not possible, it's inevitable. He's saying it's inevitable that it's going to get to them. They are judged based on what is bound to occur, obligating them to contribute to the expenses of saving the holy community of Regensburg. May their rock protect and strengthen them. Evidence, in my opinion, can be found in the Talmud tractate Bava Metzia, which we just read from, which obligates those living higher up to assist those below in repairing a drainage channel to direct water out of the city. The reasoning is that if the lower waters do not flow up, the upper waters will remain trapped in the higher areas. It is obvious that when water is blocked at the bottom of the channel, it does not immediately impact the higher portion of the channel. Rather, the water gradually rises until it affects the upper level. Do you see what we just did here? It's gradual but inevitable. It's not immediate, but it is inevitable. It's not immediate, it is gradual, and it's inevitable. Nevertheless, because the damage will eventually reach the upper level, the upper area, there is no distinction between earlier and later. And the people higher up are required to assist now. It is already a present and clear danger, even though it's going to take time for the effect to take place. The same applies here. Even though the immediate harm and danger is currently befalling the holy community of Regensburg, it is well known that others are also at risk, heaven forbid. They are therefore obligated to assist them, as I have explained.
Did this lead to more kidnappings
I was gonna
and
say.
arrests?
Like
It's simple or-
It would seem that that's the inevitable thing.
So the issue over here, Jerry is concerned that paying ransom is going to lead to more kidnapping. There was no intention over here to kidnap for ransom. They were never kidnapped for ransom.
But this.
Wait. They were never kidnapped. Listen, it's very important.
Yeah.
In this case, listen, in this case, they were never kidnapped for ransom.
Right.
They were kidnapped to be killed, to force them to confess and then kill them. That's why they were kidnapped.
And about
Wait,
the blood.
let me finish, ladies and gentlemen. They were never kidnapped for ransom. They were kidnapped for another. Then they were going to be free. They want to free them. The problem is the town needs an off-ramp. The emperor is trying to force them, and the town has accrued huge expenses as a result of this. So they want some money. Now, at this time, in this case, nobody was concerned that this would cause, there is a principle of not paying ransoms that are going to cause other people to be kidnapped. Nobody had that concern over here. In this case, it was the understanding of all the people involved and all the rabbis involved and all the discussion involved was such that this is payment to make the issue go away. In this situation, this will happen. And what indeed happened was, ladies and gentlemen, here the history becomes very important. And if you look at page 1470, sorry, not 1470, page 117, which it says libels during the 1470s in the Holy Roman Empire. Our issue, by the way, is in the middle of the page on the right. It says Trent 1475, Regensburg 1476. These issues continued until there was a whole pandemic of these kinds of things happening in the region. After the Regensburg issue was put to rest in 1480, what happened was the rabbis actually obligated all communities. The Maharik is going to say everybody has to pay because they're all affected. The money was raised, the penalties were paid, the Jews were freed, and the issue sort of died down. In fact, there were no more real libels. This issue went away. They found other reasons to persecute the Jews. But this kind of problem sort of was put to rest, and it was actually a very effective way of dealing with the issue. That's what happened historically. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one more thing, ladies and gentlemen. Wait, one more thing. The Maharik himself is not satisfied with his legal reasoning until then. He says there is a flaw in my argument. Can anyone over here identify the flaw in his arguments?
Well, was it inevitable?
That's the question.
But
So
can we
let's
go
see,
back?
page 116, the Maharik continues in his writing and he says, one might attempt to distinguish and argue that in the Talmudic case, the obligation for those higher up to assist is because the eventual damage to them is inevitable. However, here one might say that the spread of this false and slanderous accusation to other places is uncertain. It may not be exactly the same, but he says, but in truth, we see that sadly, there's a focused conspiracy to attack and incite against us. May God in his abundant mercy save us from their hands. In such a situation, the harm is considered to be certain. About such cases, it is said in the book of Proverbs, praised is the person who is always vigilant. So, ladies and gentlemen, looking at the story, you might say that at first glance, who's in danger in the story? Only the Jews of Regensburg. The Maharik's reasoning is that all other communities in the region were also in danger, and therefore he said the obligation to pay applies to all people that are in danger, and therefore all people who would benefit from this matter being put to rest. They were able to pay the ransom. They paid the money. The issue was put to rest, and things calmed down for a long time, 20, 30 years in the region. And that's the story, ladies and gentlemen, of the Maharik and his halakha. So what do we see here? We see a very fascinating communal world Jewish issue, a very sensitive question. How do we deal with this? Whose obligation is it to save these people, not only morally, but legally and financially, right? Whose obligation? Morally, obviously, everybody has a moral obligation. The question is, who has a financial obligation over here? Can we go and literally take money back from people by force for this, right? Can we obligate people to pay? And the Maharik said, yes. There is a financial obligation to every community in the region to help pay for this issue based on the reasoning of the principle in the Talmud. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience with me as we presented the idea. We're now going to open it up for a few minutes for questions and hopefully even some answers. Yes, Jerry?
One, does it say somewhere in the Torah, all Jews are responsible for one another?
That's true. There is a principle, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, all Jews are responsible for another, which means that if they come knocking at our door in New Canaan to ask us to chip in for an issue like this, we have a moral obligation. The question is, do we have a legal financial debt? Do we owe them the money financially, or is it a voluntary moral obligation? It makes a big difference. When it makes a big difference, I'm trying to raise money, ladies and gentlemen, for Chabad of New Canaan, and I'm knocking on people's doors and I'm saying, please help us, ladies and gentlemen. It's already March and cash flow is tight. So people are generous and people donate, and it's beautiful. But I can't sue them in court and say, you owe me the money. But in this case, they could be sued in court because they owe the money, because they have a financial obligation, because they benefited from the situation. That is the legal difference, and therefore the tax that was imposed was legally considered thing, and this has been brought down as a precedent for all time. Now, you can look, ladies and gentlemen, since then, the Maharik gave this verdict in the late 1470s, right? Since then, this issue of the Maharik has been cited and debated in different communities at different times. And other issues, and in the appendix of today's class at the end, there are those that applied the reasoning of the Maharik, and there are those that did not apply the reasoning of the Maharik, saying that their situation in their community at a particular time was a different circumstance. But the Maharik's precedent has become a very important precedent that has to be dealt with by any community anywhere in similar circumstances. Is there anyone else who has a question? Yes, Josh.
I think that before the whole discussion, the question is, who owns the river? If it's the king's property, the king has to take care of it, and then obviously everybody has to pay through taxes. It's like it's done today.
Okay, very, very good question. That's not the Metzias. That's not the reality in this situation. In this situation, the king's not paying. It's got to be dealt with according to these laws. It's getting dealt with according to these laws. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Gila.
Well, first a comment, if we say Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, then don't complain when someone like, what's his name, Epstein, reflects badly on all the Jews.
Okay, thank you for your
that's
comments.
one
Now, do you have a question?
I think it's kind of a bad use of the precedent because, you know, water is water, rain is rain, but it's the case of the black woman with Regensburg paying a ransom, we disregard it, but it will incentivize further more of that behavior. And apparently now in Mexico, kidnappings have become a big industry.
I understand. Thank you for that comment. The issue was raised before, and we said they decided not to consider that relevant in this situation. You feel it is relevant, write them a letter.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Laura Lee has a question or a
Who
comment.
determines inevitability?
So that's a very good question. Who determines inevitability? In this case, the determination was made by the Maharik himself.
In
Now,
present days.
in other cases, other people looked at this and said, it's not Maharik. Who's going to make the determination? In any particular case, the person who's answering the question, the judge at the time. And people, you know what? I can tell you something. Now that people are doing this, I can guarantee you that the Jew there's going to be people in Amsterdam, when they get the bill, they're going to say it's not inevitable. People are going to argue the issue of inevitability. Who's going to make the determination? In that time, at that time, you had community structures that were able to enforce these kinds of things. In today's day and age, the Jewish communal structures are much weaker. We don't have in those days, this is very important history. In those days, the Jewish community structures were a sort of autonomous government of the Jewish community. They governed the community. They had the force of the law backing them up. In today's day and age, Jewish communities, religious authorities don't have this kind of power. Today, it would. So you wouldn't see it in the halakhic system in quite the same way, but these kinds of precedents could be applied in legal cases in front of judges. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you are there other people who you can't go a second time? Anyone who has a follow-up question is welcome to discuss it with me at the end. If there's anyone who doesn't, who we haven't heard from yet, I would love to hear from you as we continue this conversation. But I don't want to spend the whole day on Regensburg, because if we do that, you guys will miss the most important situation, the crazy story of the synagogue seats in medieval Spain. Ladies and gentlemen, page 118. In medieval Spain, synagogue seating was treated as real estate. Synagogue seating was treated as real estate. Bought, mortgaged, inherited, and leased. This norm led to an unusual situation in, I have no idea how to pronounce, Satava, where a wealthy investor acquired numerous seats, causing rental prices to rise. When the community sought to add more seating, he objected. The dispute was brought before Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshes. So let me say how this works. A community needs to build a shul. So how do you get the money together? So today we go get voluntary donors, or we take a bank loan. In those days, you went to people, real estate speculators. You said, invest in our shul. You can acquire 10 seats in the shul. You'll then be able to rent those seats out for the holidays. You will get the income from those seats. You could sell those seats. Seats in shul become a real estate bonanza. I'm going to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, I haven't seen this written anywhere, but I'm going to suggest that today we have a similar phenomenon in cemeteries. In cemeteries today, people buy plots in cemeteries, and those cemeteries become real estate acquisitions. I met a guy in Israel a few weeks ago. He told me that he's a broker of real estate. I said, what are you dealing with in nowadays? He said, I am dealing in cemetery plots. He says there are certain cemeteries where prime spots in some of these cemeteries can go for a huge amount. They're very hard to get. I know contacts. I can get a good spot in any cemetery anywhere in the world. This is his business, okay? So here in these days in Spain, this is a situation where shul seats are the same. Here in America today, it's like, I can't have a seat in a shul. There's no seats, fantastic. I can't get a seat for Rosh Hashanah, thank God, right?
When I grew up, families bought seats.
You
The
bought
family
seats, but you
bought
weren't
seats.
really buying the seats. You were renting, you were buying tickets. They were giving you access to seats, and you might have been able
With
to
our
use
names
those
on 'em.
with your names on. People did dedicate seats in synagogues, but do you still own those seats? Do you have to pay an annual levy for those seats? If you don't pay the thing, is it a one-time payment for all time? So there is such a concept, but in Spain, this was huge. Now, comes along the question, we don't know, we know about this whole story we know because we find it in the writings of the Rav Yitzchak Bar Sheshes, known as the Rivash, page 119, in the margin. Let's find out who he was. He was a halachist, lived from 1326 to 1408. Rivash studied under Rabbeinu Nissim of Gerona, the Ran. Somewhere, ladies and gentlemen, I have a chart, which I'm going to try to show you next week. He lived in Barcelona and served as rabbi there and in other important Jewish communities in Spain. Because of the eruption of anti-Jewish riots in 1391, we heard about this in a previous class, remember? He fled to North Africa and settled in Algiers. He was the first to address the halachic status of the conversos. Rivash's halachic response are often quoted in Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. So the case over here is a wealthy man bought many shul seats, causing prices to skyrocket. People stopped coming to shul. What can the community do about it? That's the question. Now you got a problem. Somebody's buying up all the seats. The prices of seats are going way up. People are getting extorted for the prices of the seats. So the shul comes up with a brilliant idea. we'll build more seats. What happens if you build more seats?
Price goes down.
You devalue all the other seats. I believe that the Senate is proposing a law right now to, there's a law it might pass on Thursday to make home building easier as a way of bringing the price of housing down. You heard about this? Okay, so the same thing, build more seats in the shul. You can add seats, it will devalue all the other things. The problem is you've got limited space. So where are you going to put the seats? In the hallways. It's like Elal. Remember there used to be, you remember you used to be able to pass, you could walk down the aisle and you didn't have to bump everybody on the right and the left. Remember those days? And remember the days you could have you could sit in the aisle and you weren't necessarily getting trampled by all the people walking down the thing. I can't remember, right? You know what I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen? So the airlines have built seats in the aisles. But anyway, going back to this shul, they want to add seats in the aisles. Question, page 119 at the bottom of the page. To Ksativa, to the God-fearing Rabbi Pinchas Bar Shelemya Lunel. He's writing back to the guy that asked the question. Right? The Rivash is writing to the guy who asked the question. A community has a synagogue in their city. A wealthy man from the city purchased many seats there at a low price. Due to his actions, the value of the seats increased. As the price rose, he raised the rental fees to the point that renters were deterred from attending the synagogue because of the high cost of seating. The community wanted to add more seats in available space within the synagogue and sell those seats to various people. This would benefit the community financially and also encourage more people to attend the synagogue using the newly added seats. However, the wealthy man objected, arguing that the new seats would restrict access to his seats. He can't complain that it's going to devalue the seats. He's going to say that too much traffic. You're going to worry, we need bigger roads. You're making my roads, it's going to restrict access. Zoning laws. Even if there would be sufficient space to pass through, the passage would be narrower than before. You asked whether the wealthy man is justified in his claim. I'm going to give you my answer. So what's fascinating about this thing is he's going to deal with it purely as a real estate question. He's going to deal with it. Obviously, it's not a real estate question. It's a question of how do we get more Jews to come to shul. But the reality is people buy, we have to treat, it was sold as a real estate situation. It was traded as a real estate situation. It has to be applied for real estate situations. So we're going to have to deal with this based on real estate law. So for here, he turns back to the Talmud, page 120, text 7. Can the shul add more seats, taking space from the wealthy man's wide aisles? So for this, we're going to look at a Talmudic real estate question. In our books on page 121, you have a picture, and the same picture is on our screen. You have two homes, right? This is how real estate was built in Babylonia. This is a house built similar in Europe, where you have an alleyway going into a little. This is an alleyway, and then you have a little entryway. You go into a courtyard, and all around the courtyard, you have these homes all around the courtyard, okay? You see that?
Yeah.
So now the question is, what can you do in area A? And what are you allowed to do in area B? So if you look at page 121 in our book, and on the screen, it says like this. Area A, the Talmud is going to say, is permitted location for a structure. If you want to put a bench there, let's say you own one of the homes in the courtyard of area A. Can you put a bench there?
Yes.
So the answer is in front of your house, you can put a bench because you're not you own a shared usage. You've got a fair amount of usage of that courtyard. And even though you also have usage of area B, in area B, since it's a thoroughfare and much more widely used, you are not allowed to clog area B in the same way that you might be allowed to use area A. Let's read it in the Talmud, page 120 at the bottom of the page. Rav Huna says, If a resident of a lane wants to build a structure on the lane adjacent to their courtyard entrance, the other residents of the lane can prevent this because it will require them to circumvent the structure. In other words, in area B, they can be prevented. However, in area A, somebody would not be prevented for putting something there. So now comes the question, should a shul be treated like area A, or should the shul be treated like area B? If the shul is like area B and it's a lane, if the aisle of the shul is a lane like area B, then you shouldn't be allowed to add chairs there or seats because that blocks people's entrance. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The Rivash, in our case, ruled, you're going to love this, that actually the aisle of the synagogue is like area B. And therefore the shul has no right to build extra chairs in the aisles without the permission of somebody who owns seats, because it obstructs the aisles, and you have no right to obstruct the aisles in other real estate areas. And that is the way that the Rivash dealt this one. The question was, can the shul add more seats, taking space from the wealthy man's aisles? And he answered, no, the community has no right to diminish his access. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is a travesty. It might be the legal ruling that you can't add because real estate-wise it's a problem. But what are we going to do over here? We have a big problem over here. So the Rivash says, this is not your remedy. There is a remedy that we can use to solve the issue. There is a way we can solve the issue. You can choose as a community if you want to solve the issue this way, but you have another remedy. Your other remedy is, page 122, there's a law in Baba Basra. Residents of a city may establish local standards for measurements, producing pricing, product pricing, and wages, and impose fines for non-compliance. Cities, communities have the right to do price fixing. You can put caps on how much people can charge to rent control. You have a remedy. Your remedy is rent control. Let the shul, let the community establish that nobody can rent out a seat in the shul for more than whatever the price you make, and let the real estate speculator is then stuck with rent controls, and this would be the way that you can solve your pricing crisis in your shul with davening. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, so this is a very important thing. The Talmud says that it is legal, it is permitted for communities to impose rent controls and price controls and all the other things that believers in the free market feel are a terrible economic idea. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Talmud is not taking the view that this is a great economic idea. The Talmud is not saying that this is a great economic idea. Even that in this particular case, the rabbi is recommending it. Whether or not it is good economic policy is not really being debated over here. I can understand why some would say it might be good in some circumstances, not in other circumstances. The reality is you have this fascinating tshuva, a fascinating answer from the Rivash in the late 1300s, in which he tells a shul, you cannot build more seats, but you can do rent control on the seats, and that's the way you can solve your problem. Fascinating insight and window into a unique time in Jewish history. There's another way you do it. You don't allow seating. You don't have seat. You don't sell seats as real estate in shuls. I mean, that's another way to do it. Or there's another way. Open another shul down the road. It wasn't so they didn't really have an option to open other shuls on the road. In those days, the government, the Christian governments didn't allow new shuls to be opened. So it wasn't like they just had an option to go and build.
We also have that you don't open another business too close.
That's
Yeah.
another principle that could be done. So it's a fascinating window into things. Does anyone have any? Yes, Elaine, you've been wanting to ask a question, make a comment.
Okay, I'll make a comment about this. This wealthy man was obstructing the ability for Jews to come to synagogue and be present. So he was obstructing access. Why is that different than a lane and putting a bench in a lane and obstructing access. He was obstructing access.
He was obstructing access, he wasn't obstructing access, he was putting the price of entry as too high. It's a good question.
But
Others,
it
by the
was
way,
obstructing
argue, there were
access.
people that argued and say that real estate law shouldn't apply in quite the same way in the case of a mitzvah, and later this came up as an issue. And again, in the appendix of today's class, you look over there, you'll see some debate the other way, but you do see a fascinating principle over here. Okay? Good stuff, ladies and gentlemen. So now we've had the community in Regensburg, we've got the story of the shul seats in
The water,
Spain.
the river.
Well, that's the Regensburg story. Okay. The community, his advice was that the community should set caps on shul seat rentals. Now we're going to go to an issue of cutting edge modern technology and how cutting edge modern technology looks for precedent to deal with it. Actually, lesson 6 of this class, which we're going to do much of maybe as lesson 5, will deal with we'll deal with technology, but today we're going to deal with a very, very modern and important piece of technology in the 1400s or something called the astrolabe. How it was dealt with in the 12 and 1300s. Does anyone over here know what an astrolabe is? The question was, is it permitted to use an astrolabe on Shabbos?
It's used for navigation.
Jerry used it for. So here we're going to learn about what an astrolabe is. Jerry still uses an astrolabe to this day, but let's see.
Well, my sundial is important.
1 second. Are you allowed to use an astrolabe on Shabbos?
When is this? What time is it? What time is it? If you glance at your iPhone, it's so simple to tell the time. But I'd like to ask you, how would you tell the time if you didn't have an iPhone? How would you tell the time, say, 600 years ago? How would you do it? Well, the way you would do it is by using a device that's called an astrolabe. So an astrolabe is relatively unknown in today's world, but at the time, in the 13th century, it was the gadget of the day. It was the world's first popular computer, and it was a device that, in fact, is a model of the sky. So the different parts of the astrolabe in this particular type, the reed corresponds to the position of the stars, the plate corresponds to a coordinate system, and the mater has some scales and puts it all together. If you were an educated child, you would know how to not only use the astrolabe, you would also know how to make an astrolabe. And we know this because the first treatise on the astrolabe, the first technical manual in the English language, was written by Geoffrey Chaucer. Yes, that Geoffrey Chaucer in 1391 to his little Lewis, his 11-year-old son. And in this book, little Lewis would know the big idea. And the central idea that makes this computer work is this thing called stereographic projection. And basically the concept is, how do you represent the three-dimensional image of the night sky that surrounds us onto a flat, portable two-dimensional surface? The idea is actually relatively simple. Imagine that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and surrounding it is the sky projected onto a sphere. Each point on the surface of the sphere is mapped through the bottom pole onto a flat surface where it's then recorded. So the North Star corresponds to the center of the device. The ecliptic, which is the path of the sun, moon, and planets, correspond to an offset circle. The bright stars correspond to little daggers on the reed, and the altitude corresponds to the plate system. Now, the real genius of the astrolabe is not just the projection. The real genius is that it brings together two coordinate systems so they fit perfectly. There's the position of the sun, moon, and planets on the movable reed, and then there's their location on the sky as seen from a certain latitude on the back plate. Okay, so how would you use this, this device? Well, let me first back up for a moment. This is an astrolabe. Pretty impressive, isn't it? And so this astrolabe is on loan from us from the Oxford School of Museum of History. And you can see the different components. This is the mater, the scales on the back. This is the rete. Okay, do you see that? That's the movable part of the sky. And in the back, you can see like a spider web pattern, and that spider web pattern corresponds to the local coordinates in the sky. This is a rule device, and on the back are some other devices, measuring tools, and scales to be able to make some calculations. Okay. You know, I've always wanted one of these. For my thesis, I actually built one of these out of paper. This is a replica from a 15th century device, and it's worth probably about 3 MacBook Pros. But a real one would cost about as much as my house and the house next to it, and actually every house on the block on both sides of the street, maybe a school thrown in, and some, you know, a church. They're just incredibly expensive. To step one. First thing that you do is you select a star in the night sky if you're telling time at night. So tonight, if it's clear, you'll be able to see the summer triangle, and there's a bright star called Deneb. So let's select Deneb. Second is you measure the altitude of Deneb. So step 2, I hold the device up, and then I sight its altitude there, so I can see it clearly now. And then I measure its altitude. So it's about 26 degrees. You can't see it from over there. Step 3 is identify the star on the front of the device. Deneb is there, I can tell. Step 4 is I then move the rete, move the sky, so the altitude of the star corresponds to the scale on the back. Okay, so when that happens, everything lines up. I have here a model of the sky that corresponds to the real sky. Okay, so it is, in a sense, holding a model of the universe in my hands. And then finally, I take a rule and move the rule to a date line, which then tells me the time here. Right, so that's how the device is used. So I know what you're thinking. That's a lot of work, isn't it? Isn't it a ton of work to be able to tell the time as you glance at your iPod to just check out the time? But there's a difference between the two, because with your iPod, you can tell, or your iPhone, you can tell exactly what the time is with precision. The way little Lewis would tell the time is by a picture of the sky. He would know where things would fit in the sky. He would not only know what time it was, he would also know where the sun would rise and how it would move across the sky. He would know what time the sun would rise and what time it would set. And he would know that for essentially every celestial object in the heavens.
Okay. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we now know more about an astrolabe than we ever wanted to know. Your homework is to build an astrolabe, please.
Yeah.
And bring it in next week. The real question, ladies and gentlemen, we care about today is, are you allowed to use an astrolabe on Shabbos? So why not?
How would you know when Shabbos is over if you don't use an astrolabe?
Exactly. I even know. Exactly. It's important to have an astrolabe in Shabbos. Exactly. But are you allowed to use it? Meaning, are you allowed to put all the pieces together? The real question is, why not? The answer is it building? Is using an astrolabe on Shabbos considered building? Here's my book. So, ladies and gentlemen, this question about an astrolabe was brought to Rabbi Shlomo Ben Aderet. You'll remember him from the Rashba on page 124. On the bottom and left of our book, can an astrolabe be used on Shabbos? This question was brought to the Rashba. And the question was, does assembling the various parts of the astrolabe constitute building, which is prohibited on Shabbos? If it does, perhaps it should be prohibited to use even when assembled, as its use will inevitably lead to future assembly. Somebody might come to build with it. And if you look in the books, there's a whole bunch of other modern inventions like an umbrella and other things that, and hot air balloons we're going to talk about today as well, and what their halakhic issue is. So the Rashba, page 131, was asked this question, and he responds to Per Pignan regarding your question, is it permitted to use an astrolabe on Shabbos? So let's look back to the Talmud and see what the Talmud has to say. Find precedent. Remember, that's always the question. The question is, what is it similar to? What can we compare this case to? How do we find precedent? That's always the key issue. We're not going to suck thumb answers out of our thumbs and make up answers on the fly. We've got to come up and find precedent that's applicable. So we find the case of the sectional bed, 131. The sectional bed is a story in Shabbos, where it says, in Tractate Shabbos in the Talmud, page 47b, text 10 on page 131, the sectional bed. In the house of Rav Chama, there was a sectional bed which they would reassemble on the festivals. One of the sages said to him, what is your reasoning to permit it? How do you build a sectional bed on the Shabbos you're building? He replied, I agree with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who said that if it's a loose fitting, it is permitted. If it's easily put togetherable and take apartable, then we don't consider it a built matter, and therefore I permit you to use a sectional bed on Shabbos. And therefore he says an astrolabe, the Rashba says, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet says an astrolabe is like a sectional bed, which that's something you put it together, you take it apart, it's not a fixed thing, and therefore you're allowed to use it on Shabbos. Assembling something loose-fitting does not fall under the prohibition of Baina and is therefore permissible on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Based on this, ladies and gentlemen, can a child play with Lego on Shabbos? Or is it building?
Yeah, it's easily assembled.
So the answer is it's easily assembled, it's never permanent. It's the whole point of them is to be taken apart and put together again. Some people say that one of those Lego boats or things that you put together once and keep forever would be a problem, but free play with Lego is not such a big issue. So you see how this all.
I think this is why you can tie a bow but not a knot.
And this is, well, that's yes and no, because that's tying, but it's the same concept, yes. Is it permitted to use an astrolabe on Shabbos? The ruling from the Rashba was the astrolabe doesn't require force to assemble, so it is permitted to assemble and use it. Shabbos. It's an example of how cutting-edge technology in the 1300s was resolved according to Talmudic precedent. In other words, there's always got to be a new gadget. How do you know if you can use it? You look to the Talmud, you look to precedent. You try to apply old ideas to new scenario. And then came the great hot air balloon conundrum. Does a hot air balloon pose a halachic problem for a sukkah? Let's look, ladies and gentlemen, to this question that was asked in 1908. Rabbi Moshe Perlmatter lived in Lodz in Poland. He died in 1920. And he wrote a letter to, I'm on page 133. And he wrote a letter to his teacher and another rabbi, Rabbi Shalom Mordechai Hakohen, the chief judge of the community of Berezhny. Live and be well. Okay, so he wrote this question to this other sage, who, if you look at him, page 135, in the margin, Rabbi Shalom Mordechai Schwadron is his name. He was a halachic authority born in Zlotchev in Galicia. He was a follower of the Rebbe of Belz, and he's known by the Maharsham. And he was a rabbi in a place called Brezhin in Ukraine. And he was considered one of the leading authorities in his region. Okay? So this rabbi in Lodz has this amazing question, new question, phenomenal question he wants to ask to the rabbi in Brezhin. Our teacher, Rabbi on page 133, our teacher, 1908, right? 1908. It's a new machine, a flying machine. They haven't even invented an airplane yet, am I right?
Yeah, the airplane came in 1902.
So they already have an airplane, but when was the airplane?
Yeah, 1902.
They had an airplane, but definitely not in Lodz.
Not in Lodz.
Our teacher, Rabbi Shalom Mordechai Hakohen, chief judge of the community of Berezhny, live and be well. I have been struck by a new matter that has never arisen before. Inventors have recently brought into reality the ability to soar in a hot air balloon. Humans control it so that if they want to remain stationary at a high altitude, they can do so, remaining there even when there are strong winds. The hot air balloon is large in both length and width. We're not just talking about a one man. You could have a 30-man hot air balloon, right? Or you could have what was that famous, the Hindenburg.
Hindenburg.
What is the halachic status of a sukkah if a hot air balloon is seen hovering directly above it? Matters render the sukkah invalid.
Yes.
So Claude says yes.
No.
If a sukkah is underneath a hot air balloon, it is invalid, says Mr. Bernstein. Giller says that it's permitted, right?
If it's high enough.
So Giller says the crucial issue is height.
The legal concept of air rights also.
Giller says the issue is height, and Claude says it's not allowed because we know
It's not
the
stationary.
sukkah has to be directly under the skies. It cannot be under a tree. So what about if it's under a hot air balloon?
Yeah,
What if a bird is hovering high above,
What
some
if-
birds can.
Page 134. So how do we know? Ladies and gentlemen, we need to look at precedent. Claude looks at precedent thinking it's like a tree. But let's see. The following do not bring impurity. The Talmud says the following do not bring impurity. A flying cloak and a ship floating on the water. However, if the ship is tied with something that keeps it steady, or a stone is on the cloak holding part of it down, they can bring impurity. So here's a very important thing. Everybody knows that if there's a dead body under a roof, all the things underneath that roof become impure. Right? So now that's a roof with walls. Now comes the question, what about a ship? If there's a dead body on the ship, does everything underneath the ship become impure? And the water? Or what if a flying coat, a magic carpet with a dead body on it? Did you see that meme the other day of the Iranians chasing jets with magic carpets? Didn't see that one? Okay. But what if you have a flying, well, it could happen, by the way, a coat gets swept up in the wind, and then something underneath it. Does the thing underneath it become impure from this flying coat? So the Talmud says no. If it's anchored, then it's considered a tent, and anything under it becomes impure. But if it's flying in the wind, the answer, my son, is flying in the wind. Blowing in the wind. If it's blowing in the wind, then nothing becomes impure underneath it. So therefore, his ruling is, page 135, by the grace of God, the third day of Chol Hamoed Sukkot, in the year 1908, he's writing this on the holiday, to the Honorable Rabbi Scholar Rabbi Moshe Perlmutter, Rabbi of Large, live and be well. Due to Chol Hamoed, I will be brief and reply succinctly. As explained in chapter 8 of Mishnah Oyalos, a ship floating on the water and a flying cloak do not bring impurity. This is true even if they are stationary, as noted by the commentaries. Only when the ship is tethered to the land and only when a stone is placed on the edge of the cloak does it qualify as a tent. Accordingly, in our case, the hot air balloon is not considered a tent and does not invalidate the sukkah beneath it. It is not considered a covering, and therefore you can eat in that sukkah cloth even though there's a hot air balloon flying above you. Even if it's an airplane or anything else, your sukkah does not become invalidated if the thing is not, unless it is anchored to the ground. Ladies and gentlemen, does a hot air balloon pose this thing? So the thing, sukkah law. Jewish law requires that a sukkah be built directly under the sky. If a tree hangs over the sukkah, even if it's high up, it invalidates the sukkah. The rabbi said, I've been struck by a new matter that has never arisen before. So let's look at precedent. Well, we have the case of a flying tent. If it's unanchored, it's halachically insignificant. If it's anchored, it's halachically significant. So does a hot air balloon pose a halachic problem for a sukkah? He rules that no, since it isn't anchored to the ground. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take that 10,000 foot view of the situation. What's going on? Going on over here, ladies and gentlemen, is you have a Torah that was given to us by God's Son. Right? Judaism is anchored in a God-given Torah. At the same time, new situations are going to arise all the time. In which case, Hashem says, you must use your minds and go to the judges of your time. And the judges have to think for themselves and try to apply Torah to the world. And this is the beauty of Judaism. Judaism is a religion that comes with a Torah from God, and the most creative human innovation from below. The great partnership between us and Hashem in Torah learning, recognizing precedents. We're not trying to figure out every answer in ourselves. We have a Torah that gives us guidance, but we have to use our own creative thinking to try to figure out how to work with it. So, Torah law, the human mind, together, this approach to Torah study bridges the gap between heaven and earth. We're going to watch a little video of key points of today's lesson, and we're going to call it a day. If anyone has any further questions and comments, I'm available to discuss things with everybody for at least 17 hours on this.
Lesson 3. Precedent in practice. 1. Moses' decision to break the tablets was an act of halachic reasoning by analogy, and God affirmed his conclusion. This set a precedent for rabbinic decision-making, rabbis applying existing Torah principles when facing new questions and winning divine approval. 2. Whether it was Rabbi Yosef Kolon's bold ruling obligating all communities to help free the Regensburg prisoners, or Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Sheshet's nuanced handling of a synagogue seat shortage in Shetiva, the responsa literature shows how rabbis applied existing Talmudic law to unique and unexpected situations. 3. Halachic rulings don't exist in a vacuum. Rabbi Yosef Kolon's decision wasn't just a legal interpretation. It was informed by a sharp reading of the anti-Semitic climate of his time. 4. Judaism sees human innovation as part of the divine plan, meant to be harnessed for goodness and holiness. But the emergence of the new, from the astrolabe during the Middle Ages to the hot air balloon in modern times, often raises new halachic questions. Rabbis have historically met these advances with a commitment to applying timeless principles to modern developments. 5. When we apply Torah law to new realities, we forge a sacred and profound bond between the human mind and God's will. 6. Every Jew is called upon to apply the Torah to new realities. While practical rulings are reserved for qualified experts, engaging in this process in a conceptual manner deepens our relationship with the Torah and with God.
Any questions or comments, ladies? Ladies and gentlemen, the class is now over. I thank everybody for joining us here today. It was wonderful to see you all and to spend the time with you, studying, debating, analyzing. To those people that wanted to speak more and I didn't give up the microphone, I apologize, ladies and gentlemen. I would love to hear from you now, but I knew there was a lot of material we had to get through and wanted to try to finish somewhat on time. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us here today. That concludes today's class. If anybody would like to stay around and chat and discuss, you are welcome to. And I would love to hear from you and discuss. And I will leave the Zoom on as well. And this way we can continue the conversation. Yes, Josh Klugman.
A comment about the breaking of
What's a beat?
I think it's the Rebbe said it, that Moses, it was a thing of genius. Because when he was coming down and he didn't hand the tablets to the Jews yet, it was not binding. So he broke it before it became binding.
They look at it as a marriage contract. Often looked at it in that way.
Beautiful. Thank you, Josh, for that beautiful insight. Yes, Gila.
I remember reading, I think also when where we read this, I said in the commentary that like Moses is breaking the Luchot HaBrit in a way to kind of exemplify that those are objects, whilst the ideas, you can't break the ideas.
Beautiful. Also, very interesting. The object was
So in a way,
the ideas are
to teach the rest of us that this is just a stone object, whilst the 10 Commandments will live on.
Great insight. Thank you, Gila. Beautiful. Jerry.
Just taking back to the last few parshas, in terms of raising money for the Mishkan. There were 2 rounds of fundraising. One, people gave based on the generosity, but there was another round where everybody had to give a half shekel. And it's similar to this
So there's
Regensburg.
this concept that there's sometimes voluntary gifts and there's obligatory gifts and they're not.
Of course, the
exactly
entire
same.
community was benefited.
Absolutely, interesting, very interesting. One could maybe apply the same rationale that there's an element that everybody benefits from, that every has to contribute to, but there's an element that's more personal. You could maybe do something with that.
The extra money, I want to get more seats.
Understand?
And then rent them out to
As-
people.
As you should, as you should.
Yeah, right. Investment bank.
That's also a Moses question.
Okay, great.
So it said, if I'm understanding correctly, that Moses breaking the tablets was justified because it wasn't because of the halakhic law.
He used a halakhic idea to justify it.
But wasn't Moses punished for doing that by not being allowed to go into Israel?
I think Moses' not being allowed to go into Israel was later when he hit the
Later.
rock instead
Hit
of
the rock,
speaking to them. So that was,
Wow.
it wasn't the tablets that.
It wasn't the
It
tablets.
wasn't about
No,
the tablets,
no.
it's about the gifts as well. So that's interesting, so changes, so that's
It wasn't.
interesting. In
Yeah,
fact,
that
there's a beautiful teaching that God agreed with Moses and actually thanked him later and said, you did a great job of breaking those tablets, so you did, because you saved.
And
the
gave
people."
him new tablets.
So that's
Because it says to
interesting.
people what?
Because it say, as Josh said before, bringing the tablets say on them, don't worship other gods, don't commit adultery, don't do. And here there's people who so-called married God at Sinai is worshiping other gods. They're guilty on all counts. So by smashing the tablets, he says, well, they never got the instructions, so they can be excused. Or they never got the marriage contract, which there's
That was the foundation.
So in other words, Moses saves the people by breaking the tablets. That's one way of understanding the story. That's what John says. It's a beautiful teaching. Gila,
Just a comment that the story about the man who bought those seats in the shul and kind of raised the price. It kind of reminds me like today, there are all kinds of laws, antitrust and against monopolies, which could prevent this kind of behavior of having exclusive or almost exclusive control over a certain product and service, and then raising the price out of.
exactly, that's very interesting. And that's sort of what the Rivash sort of advises. As the straight up legal real estate thing, the laws of the sky, but you have other remedies in your hands. And usually these kinds of things, if they go and threaten him now to cap the price of shul seats, he might want to sell his seats quickly and that might unblock the market. And these are the kinds of things that still exist. Read the news.
Every minute.
These kinds of negotiations that are ongoing about shul seats.
Murders.
Everywhere else. Very interesting. Any other questions or comments, ladies and gentlemen?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah,
you all
it's
for
all
being here.
fascinating.
Again, I apologize for limiting the debate because I just needed to try to keep a focus on getting through the material, but thank God we've had a time.
Better.
Okay.
We understand.
It's fantastic to be here.
Say hello to us.
Yeah, and I look forward to seeing you
Okay.
again
Yeah.
next week, ladies and gentlemen, for lesson 4. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
you.
Have a wonderful week.
Were you meeting with Clark?
Does he have a
Pardon?
Were you supposed to meet? I'm not in a.
But I don't know what he's doing. I don't know what's, we were gonna have a meeting.
I'm not in a hurry if you want. I'll have a couple of tea.